Well, welcome to the latest in our web podcast for Devon and Cornwall Record Society. We are talking to various authors about recent research, and I'm very pleased to say we have Dr. Richard Oliver with us, who is a research fellow or an honorary research fellow at Exeter University since 1989. And he's co-author of the wonderful British Town Maps and its database, which one can access. Other people will know him first from his Ordnance Survey publications. He's become Mr. Ordnance Survey in my mind, at least. But all things maps for Devon is what we're looking at today. And this particular book won Devon Book of the Year, and Richard's piece was instrumental in explaining it. But can you tell me more all about the book?
Yes, it's called William Birchinshaw's Map of Exeter 1743. It's actually it was inspired by the discovery of the Birchynshaw map in 2018, but it does include reproductions of a lot of the other early maps of Exeter, a fairly comprehensive set from the earliest, which is by Hooker in 1587, up to the late 18th century, and rather more selective after that, because the maps become rather more numerous and not always more interesting. But there's a bit of fun in that it ends with a bus map of about 1947. Even in those days, Exeter had lettered buses rather than numbered ones on the town routes. The Birchynshaw map is a very peculiar thing because it cannot be readily slotted into any course of development. There are two ways you can produce a map, really. One of them is to go out, do a necessary survey and produce it that way. Or the other is to get hold of somebody else's map and copy it, possibly with or without tweakings and additions. The Hooker map of 1587 was an original survey, whereas the Speed version, which came out in 1611 as an inset on his county map, is a copy from Hooker, a fairly uncritical copy. Generally, Speed is far better when he was doing his own maps, and he produced a pretty good result. Anyway, the Birchynshaw map is curious because it doesn't relate to any of the maps of Exeter produced in the late 17th, the early 18th centuries. The shape of the city walls is quite different, and the styling of the buildings is rather different. In fact, it's rather anomalous. It's a rather old-fashioned looking map for its date of 1743. It's more the sort of thing you would expect to appear in the no later than the later 17th century. Very nice map of the late 17th century. In fact, it has a bit of the air of the map of Barnstaple, which is going to be by Newcourt of around 1650, which is going to be republished very shortly. So the odd thing is that apart from the fact that Birchynshaw seems to have made his own survey, also it appears to be engraved on pewter, which is the most peculiar material. Earlier maps were engraved on wood, but this method was pretty much certainly obsolete, if not obsolete, by 1600. And engraving on copper was a far more satisfactory way of doing it, because copper was reasonably strong, but it was also fairly soft and could take a fairly fine line. It is actually due to you, Todd, that we trace that Birchynshaw seems to have been a pewterer, and that might explain the rather curious choice of base material. Otherwise, Birchinshaw's map is like a great many maps in that we have the map itself, but we have to find a motive for its existence. It's maybe suspected that he decided to produce one as a little piece of local enterprise, and he was then completely swept out of the way by the John Roke map of Exeter, which appeared in the following year. It was reproduced in the book and is a far better known map. But Birchynshaw does have his points of interest, even though one sometimes wonder whether the map is telling you more about the modes of its production than it is about the landscape it purports to depict.
Well, it's a fascinating account of the map. Now you've kind of given away some of your sources. I mean, what you've done is you've looked at the succession of maps in Exeter, not in themselves, but really in this chain of knowledge, and it's a progression of cartographical information and specialization and skill. I mean, is that what you'd say the main source is, that each one talks about each other like an extended family?
Each one tends to often to be a derivative of another. There are new surveys which come along, some of them relatively late. For example, towards the end of the book, we reproduced John Wood's map of Exeter of about 1839 or thereabouts, which it seems to be a completely independent survey. Similarly, William Stukeley's antiquarian map of Exeter of 1723, I think that was an original survey, because Stukeley produced a number of others, and it's very difficult to find derivatives of it. On the other hand, the Roke map produced several derivatives in the later 18th century.
I mean, you know, it is fascinating to think of them as this family which is slightly related and then not related, almost like monarchs.
Mm.
I mean, they'd have their own little period and then superseded by somebody else. I mean, when you were writing your piece with Roger Kane, what surprised you, or what came out of it? You know, because you're forced to look at 400 years or so of map making.
Yes.
What
some of the story is actually quite familiar and been written up in the past. Others of it can do with revisiting. One of them is the sort of post mid-19th century aspect of things, which older cartographic historians were rather inclined to let slide on the basis the Ordnance Survey came along, and after that it was all far too boring to be worth bothering about, quite apart from the fact the Ordnance Survey didn't do sea serpents. But in practice, you get maps, and some of the source data is going to be the Ordnance Survey, some of it's going to be independent. And I think this also goes with the earlier maps. You can explain away the basic shape of a map by saying it derives from an earlier identifiable survey, but there may still be details on it which are difficult to explain other than by the map maker or someone acting in his behalf, having gone out and actually investigated the ground.
I mean, do you think there are still missing maps of Exeter that some of these may be copies of?
It's a quite nice explanation, isn't it? Anytime you get a document which doesn't quite hang together, to assume that it derives from something else which isn't available right now. It's in the case of the earlier maps of Exeter, the line of descent from the 1580s Hooker map is fairly clear. In the case of Birchynshaw, a lack of any line of descent is also abundantly clear. He exists almost without context, and the only way that context is provided is by an actual date on the map, which one would be inclined to disbelieve were it not that the squeaky new RD&E hospital is there, which had only been built the previous year. So it does rather look, from the scraping of the plate, as though the hospital had been inserted as a fairly last-minute thing.
Well, it's a fascinating book. Well, I would say that, but I think it really is. And what you've done is a tremendous service to the community, because you know, we had Bill Ravenhill back in the 80s and 90s who was working on maps, but you've really taken up the lead since then. And it's one of the great riches of Exeter are its maps. Yeah.
It's certainly better served than some other cities. As you've mentioned, Roger Kane and I did this big project on British town maps, which covered really everything which has been produced, certainly in print, from the 1480s through to 1900. And the balance of cover for cities, it can be remarkably variable. I think Exeter does quite well because it was, in economic terms, a fourth or fifth city until well into the 18th century. And I think that's one reason why it would have attracted attention, though not, I think, the only one. I mean, if you want a real contrast to this, the earliest known map of Glasgow, and even then it's only covers part of the future city area, dates from as late as 1765.
Gosh.
Less than 100 years before the Ordnance Survey hit
Mm.
town and get to work.
Gosh. Well, we are lucky then.
Yes.
Compared to them. Right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Richard. Now, anyone watching this will know that the Record Society does sell William Birchinshaw's map through Stevens Books, but we can get it through Boyd Ellen Brewer or through any bookseller. So on behalf of everybody watching, thank you, Richard. And I hope everybody will turn into our next podcast.
Thank you.